thank you very much for being here. Thank you for attending Hili Forum. We're very happy that we were able to gather such an esteemed group of panelists with us today. Our panel is going to be about strategic alliances, strategic partnerships, to sort of see and understand how states are undertaking and moving forward with new partnerships and new alliances versus, some old ones as well. And as most of you know, our world is becoming ever connected, but also more and more fragmented as time goes by. So strategic partnerships and alliances are essential for states to survive and become more resilient against crises, against shocks. But they also provide a very good platform through which states can thrive and cooperate with each other on a plethora of issues, be it tech, be it climate change, be it trade and economic growth as well. However, it is not always easy or straightforward for states to navigate their pre-existing alliances and the new partnerships that they need to undertake in a world that is becoming, more based on national interest and more based on pragmatic and ad hoc partnerships. And so that's why we gathered with us today this esteemed group of speakers and panelists in order to better understand why states choose to go through or to go into certain alliances and not others, and why they choose an alliance versus a partnership. And please allow me to introduce our speakers today. To my right is His Excellency Ambassador Ridwaan Jadwat, the Ambassador of Australia to the United Arab Emirates. I also have Dr. Tristen Naylor, the co-founder and executive director of the Oxbridge Diplomatic Academy. Professor Dr. Elham Manea is an associate professor at the Institute for Political Science at the University of Zurich. And then on that side of the table, we have Dr. Mahmoud Sari al-Ghalam, non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. And then last but not least, Adel Hamaizia, the managing director of Highbridge Advisory. Thank you all for being with us today. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to be asking one question to each panelist and then allowing our speakers to sort of give a 7 to 8 minute intervention. And then we'll move to Q&A and to asking the questions that I will be receiving on the iPad. So I first want to start with Ambassador Jadwat. Your Excellency has quite an extensive diplomatic experience that spans more than 25 years, as we discussed yesterday. So in your experience, what are the key ingredients of successful strategic partnerships, and what factors, be it economic, political, security, what drives them? So I sort of wanted to use that question to set the tone for the rest of the conversation. So really interested to hear what Your Excellency has to say.
Well, thank you, Sarah, and wonderful to be here with all of you on such an esteemed panel. In terms of strategic partnerships and alliances, I would start by saying that we live, obviously, I think, in a very uncertain global environment at the moment, a multipolar world where smaller countries like Australia or middle powers need to be agile and flexible as we navigate our way through very turbulent waters. Important ingredients, therefore, include agility and flexibility, but also I think you have to try to find strategic trust in building these relationships or partnerships. You need to have communication, you need to have cultural understanding and cultural sensitivity, and also mutual respect. And I have two examples of how Australia has been able to forge strategic partnerships in this uncertain environment. I'll start off with a bilateral aspect. So last year, we negotiated and signed the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with the UAE. This is the first free trade agreement that Australia has negotiated with any country in the Middle East. And it was also the fastest free trade agreement that we've negotiated from scratch in Australian history. Okay. So I'm very proud of the work that our team did on this agreement. But this agreement is not just about trade in goods and services. It's also about strategic trust. It's about Australia looking to diversify our economic trade and investment relationships and looking to this part of the world and seeing the UAE as an entrepot, as a gateway to the Middle East and Africa and Central Asia. And so for us, it's about defining new partnerships. And the UAE absolutely is our strongest and most important partner in this part of the world. And so for us, the SEPA, as we call it, it's not just about economics, it's also about economic security, and economic security is increasingly about national security. So in developing this partnership with the UAE, we also developed an investment agreement and 5 investment MOUs that basically look to the future. It touches on data centers and AI, critical minerals, infrastructure, as well as the mainstays like food and agriculture. And so for us, this is forging a new destiny for Australia in this part of the world with a very strong partner in the UAE.
Okay.
And then when I look to our region in the Indo-Pacific, of course, that's our backyard. And Australia's worked very, very closely with ASEAN in terms of regionalism. And so we've worked closely with ASEAN through the ASEAN Regional Forum, through the East Asia Summit, through the ASEAN Defence Ministers Plus arrangement. And so for us, regionalism and ensuring that a rules-based international system is still protected, and as much as we can do to preserve it. Obviously, it's under stress right now. But I think working towards building a region where sovereignty is protected, economic sovereignty and political sovereignty, so that we live in a region where no one country dominates, where we're not dominated by one another, and we uphold sovereignty. So I think these strategic partnerships that are starting to continue to become a phenomenon around the world are becoming increasingly important, because countries can see that you have to elevate these bilateral relationships in this uncertain environment to give yourself more security, more prosperity, and more certainty at the moment.
I was saying that His Excellency mentioned sovereignty and security as being very important principles to uphold, but they also are very important national interests to uphold. So I want to turn to Dr. Mahmoud with my second question, which is, how can rising powers, rising middle powers, pursue their own national interests and manage the long-term risks and as they navigate and sort of want to make these short and medium-term partnerships. So when we're talking about, for example, a partnership, it could work for a few years, but then it could break down a few years later. So how can states sort of weigh these long-term risks? How can they think of short-term goals as they pursue their national interests?
Thank you, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be here with my colleagues. Clearly, our focus is about rising powers, and by that, we probably mean countries like India, like Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Brazil, Mexico, Vietnam. These are examples of rising powers. Depending on the size of their economies and size of population, digital economy, and FDI of different countries, I think we need to customize strategies for both building alliances or even more precise building partnerships. But I think it is possible to develop maybe 4 different roadmaps on how to build stable and prosperous kind of partnerships. The first one that I like to refer to is how countries manage their relations with the 3 powers. I think all indices indicate that for the rest of the century, we're going to be dealing with 3 powers, with the United States being the dominant power. If we just look at numbers, 61% of all the investment in semiconductors in the world are focused in the United States. 17% in China, 6% in the European Union. 27% of all energy production in the world is in the United States. So my conclusion with the first roadmap would be that for all rising powers, it is essential to maintain a normal, evolving relationship with the United States. With China, it is indispensable. All countries need somehow to deal with China. Russia, I would say it is useful, maybe not economically, but as a major power in the world. My second roadmap has to do with geography. I think we tend to underestimate the salience of geography in partnerships. We focus too much on economic relations, but I think even if we want to develop interdependencies, it must happen within regions first. Obviously, European Union is a classic example, and then the rise of ASEAN is another example. I was just looking at the numbers a few days ago. ASEAN is now a regional integrated institution with almost $4 trillion of GDP. And they were able to deal with China at the level of $2 trillion. So I think partnerships at the regional level are very crucial compared to the global level. My third roadmap, and the first two I dealt with the international system. The latter two I'm dealing with domestic issues. I'm a great believer in domestic structures. And I think as long as countries do not reinforce their domestic capabilities, they're not going to be very be able to develop effective partnerships outside of their country. My third roadmap has to do with constant consensus building processes inside countries and adequate attention to politics of distribution and also financial transparency. Dealing with these kinds of issues will cultivate a roadmap so that countries will be reliable partners, not only in their immediate region, but also for global partners. My last roadmap has to do with investment in infrastructure. And I think diversification of industries, bureaucratic efficiency, meaningful but limited regulatory systems, and specifically focusing on FDI. I think FDI is such a significant index of displaying how countries are categorized in the international system. And obviously, the higher the FDI index for a particular country, the more they become reliable partners at the global and also regional level. So those are my four roadmaps: two focusing on domestic structure and two focusing on the realities of the global system. I think we are in the post-globalization period. Whether we agree with the essentials of the world system, we are dealing not so much with institutions, but also we're dealing with state-centered international system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. I like the structured way and the four areas or roadmap as you mentioned, with which we all states, whether rising or not rising, or middle powers or strong powers, can continue to navigate international relations. But I want to turn now to Dr. Elham. Choosing between a partnership which might be more fluid or an alliance which might be more rigid, perhaps, in your opinion, which one is better for states so that they can sort of pursue or retain their strategic autonomy? Which one would you choose?
To be honest, I think our first instinct is to say partnership. The first instinct, but a more realistic answer would be is neither is inherently better. It's a tool. Both are tools. And how do we use them? How a state can actually leverage them is important, specifically in this changing world order. And I have to basically also connect them, both of them, to the paradigms that are related to them. So alliances are usually seen through a realist lens. Okay, they are about survival, about balancing threats in an archaic world. The US GCC alliances that was for the last decades one form of alliance. Israel's long-standing relationship with Washington is another. But they are not only defensive shields. If you look, you will see also there's an approach that state can also use these alliances as a leverage to exploit the seams of the international order, as done during the Cold War. I mean, north of Yemen, if you look at the foreign policy of north of Yemen, how they leverage these seams and the rivalry between the United States and Soviet Union, you saw a certain kind of exploiting these seams. And today, you see also cracks that open when the system is in flux, when one superpower retrenches and another rises. I think Dr. Naimi mentioned that. How do we leverage these changing order without sleepwalking into conflict? That was his sentence. Oman has also been particularly skilled at this, maneuvering between Washington, Riyadh, and Tehran to preserve its autonomy. And there is also a nuance that I would like to emphasize. Alliances are not only realist, they're also constructivist. And that here, there is the logic about shared identity, ideology, or norms. And non-state actors like Houthis, Hezbollah, their alliances with Iran are sustained by a revisionist political project and rooted in certain world kind of view, by sectarian solidarity and by narrative of resistance. But alliances can be realist or constructivist, but the logic must remain intact. Once that logic unravel, also these alliances unravel. And we see that with the United States right now and how it's behaving. We see also that the limits of these alliances with the Qatar crisis in a moment, you know. Partnership here, we have a liberal kind of perspective. Partnership talks about reflect the liberal paradigm. They are flexible arrangement built on interdependence and mutual gains. The Abraham Accords are not just about countering Iran, it's also about promised trade, technology, climate cooperation. A Gulf partnership with China or India, these are the diversification option and reduced dependence on a single hegemon. But partnership also have their limits. They are fragile. They depend on trust and shared interests. And trust is the word that you use, Ambassador Jadwat. And that is very important for them to continue.
Yeah.
And the limits is always, it's like, for me, what are the limits of alliances and partnerships as well? That's the question that we also have to pose. Alliances can create dependency if the balance of power is too asymmetric. Partnership, meanwhile, can collapse when trust evaporates or interests diverge. And here, let's just remember that we in our region, identity, ideology, sectarian narratives, all of these redraw the boundaries of collaboration. And again, I go to non-state actors. Houthi, Hezbollah, Hamas, they're often described as regional proxies. That's one way of looking at it. But let's not forget that they're rooted within political and social dynamics. And this mix, local grievances and regional sponsorship, that makes them such powerful spoilers of collaboration. And the Abraham Accords as well were meant to be a model of pragmatic partnership grounded in trade, technology, security. But as the EU, the UAE recently warned, also today, Ms. Nusayba said, annexing the West Bank is a red line, and one sees here that trust is very much an important factor. Otherwise, it will unravel. So power explains some things, interests explain others, but meaning explains the rest. And I'm coming back to your original question, which is better? Neither and both. They're tools. And strategic autonomy is not about choosing one over the other. It's about using both wisely, exploiting the seams of a shifting global order, preserving the logic, and at the same time, not forgetting that certain ideology, spoilers, far-right ideologists like those in the Netanyahu's government can redraw the rules of collaboration overnight, often to destabilizing effect.
No.
That's about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elham. As a political scientist and someone who studied international relations, it's always refreshing, I think, to me at least, to hear IR theory being used in panels, because we don't normally use these theoretical paradigms much in the real or practical world. But I think they're very, very useful. I want to turn to Mr. Adel Hamaizia now and ask you, if I may, about the rise of these new global partnerships, such as the expansion of the BRICS, and we're seeing more of these, also corridors being created, like the Belt and Road Initiative, like IMAC. So how does the rise of these new corridors, the expansion of these partnerships with one country, so how can you maybe explain to us why we're seeing more of those, especially in the context of this, new but rather also old US-China rivalry? So I was wondering if you can maybe touch on that aspect as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sar, and thank you to ECSSR and AGDA for having me. Everybody can hear very well? Yes? All right, so we're going to discuss Plato to NATO, to SCO, to BRICS, right? Bricks and mortar, and we can go on and on. Can I ask, has anybody heard of tuna? Does anybody like tuna?
Yes.
Yeah? Does anybody know what it stands for?
Sushi?
Can be sushi. We just had a resignation in Japan. But it's turbulence, uncertainty, novelty, and ambiguity. We heard about alliances versus partnerships on the balance sheet. One could argue that this status quo works well in the old alliance metric post-war, post-World War II. But I think in this current epoch, alliances don't work as well when it comes to this sort of tuna perspective. And there's a joke around black swans, and they say that all swans are black in the dark, right? And that's something to think about. Now, in terms of sort of middle powers, and I want to GCCify the conversation since we're in the Gulf a little bit, and I'm going to come back to your point on BRICS. Just to be a bit provocative, manipulative, we say alliances are rigid, use the term maybe al dente. You can speak of partnerships being maybe, easier, flexible, promiscuous, perhaps. But what I wanted to sort of bring to the table is this, theoretically, we have the theorist here, this theory of equidistance, right? How do you keep everybody happy? Is it possible? Can you have 50 shades of hedging? Can you segment hedging? Is it realistic? Can you do that with Washington and China? And to that end, I'll share two very brief comments that came out of recent conversations, and then I'll share something from our own company. So the first is I was sitting with a Trump official just a few less than a week ago. And I said to him, oh, what is your perspective on alliances, partnerships, etc.? And he said to me the following. He said, he sort of referred to sort of the sort of old quote about power. And he said, the purpose of power, very reductionist, the purpose of power is to extract resources from weaker states, correct? Right? Maybe. He said to me, and he also then quoted a certain Churchill. I'm a British Londoner, so I think he thought it was appropriate. And Churchill, of course, said, you can always count on the Americans after you've exhausted all other alternatives or options. And what he was getting at, he sort of said to me within the context of the Middle East or middle powers, what he was referring to, what he was trying to say to me is that, yes, maybe in the future, Vance administration or a hard left, you might see more sort of reduction in footprint in the region. But this hedging approach will make it even more difficult to circle back to the US in the way that one might think is possible. And of course, we've heard about AI, et cetera, et cetera. There might be some areas which are very black and white, whereas others are, again, 50 shades of gray. Now, when it comes to a colleague in MENA, I was speaking to recently, just to show you a different perspective, I said we were talking about Gaza actually, and we were talking about US versus China. And I said, how do you sort of put together China, Europe, US? And he said, solid liquid gas. And I said, what do you mean? Because solid then became liquid, right? Because we saw very little Chinese intervention engagement, all but $4 million in terms of support for Gaza. If you look at the numbers, and I'll come back to the company and the BRICS point. If you look at the numbers, we're talking about $100 billion trade between US and the Middle East, $450 billion for China. Of course, on the defense side of the ledger, that's very different, though it has been falling. If I were to ask anybody in the room, when BRICS was formed in 2001, or the acronym came together, does anybody know what the BRICS GDP was as a percentage of global GDP? Anybody hazard a guess? You get a date cookie after the session. Anybody? Have a go, somebody, or you, sir, you, madam.
That's
What number?
10.
10%? Very good. It was 12%. You don't count because you're at the table. So it was 12%. G7 was 65. On the current trajectory, by 2045, we're expecting more than a role reversal. It'll be 65% for BRICS and 20% for G7. I repeat, 20% for G7. Now, when it comes to BRICS, there's this whole discourse or discussion. We're sitting in the UAE, a new member. Is it economics? Is it politics? So in 2001, if you can imagine a metaphorical or literal X and Y axis, you had fast markets and high growth and fast and large market size, right? And in the top right-hand corner, you had this 4 countries crib. It was China, Russia, India, and Brazil, and this country called South Africa joined later, and it didn't mess up. The acronym, at the time, Lord Jim O'Neill, chief economist of Goldman Sachs, was really putting this together for a prospectus for investors. Later, they had a summit in 2009, and of course, by 2023, with the new players in town, one could argue that same criteria did not hold. Why? I put them into 3 buckets. You had the strugglers, Ethiopia, Argentina, Egypt, all suffering from FX shortages, challenges, dollar challenges, et al. Argentina left with Milei. You had the sanctioned in Iran, and you had the sailors, as I would call them, Emirates and Saudi, though Saudi has not officially joined. So one could argue this became a geoeconomic project, and it is on that current trajectory. What does that mean for red and blue supply chains? Can we have purple ones? Question mark, open, and we're going to see how middle powers can navigate this continuing sort of geoeconomic game. A small example from a company we run called Highbridge Advisory. So we do a lot of work in the Middle East, Balkans, and Africa. One practice is what we call due diligence and market entry for investors. So we had a group of investors, and now listen to this carefully. We had a US investor with US capital that was going to put money in this region, the Middle East. I won't name the 3 countries. They're going to deploy capital in the renewable space. Significant investment. It was in the hundreds of M's. We didn't reach B's. And what was going to happen? They were going to use Chinese hardware. There was a single source op-ed that spoke to Xinjiang human rights abuses, which was through work that we did and our partners, factory level due diligence in 12 locations in China, including Xinjiang. And I condemn any abuses that happen anywhere, including in China. And what happened? The investment was called off. We lost repatriation of profits for the US, job creation in the Middle East, and purchase of Chinese hardware. Why? Because of US-China competition and because of an inability to manage Xinjiang Business Advisory, what they call CFIUS now in the US. And we're going to see more and more of this. So how do we navigate? How do we mitigate? How do we pretend and extend? These are open questions. Now, this idea of sort of US being less extractive and erratic, this is again a question on how do you manage this? And this is something that I think a lot of our diplomats from this morning and beyond are going to have to grapple with going forward. The answer to the BRICS is it is a geoeconomic and it's a political project, but it's clearly there are economic dividends. Now, the big question is China offers economic security at domestic level, whereas you have the Americans offering external security provision. One of the comments my American friend said to me, he said, Adel, imagine a context of Chinese ensuring, metaphorically, not my way or the Huawei, but the freedom of navigation. What would that mean? Would that be discounted barrels? Open question. Would that mean you can tell us where and how we can deploy our capital? Question mark. I was even told that there are some smaller states with large sovereign wealth funds. Would they have the trillions that they have, or would it be maybe slightly smaller if there was more quid pro quo in a different context that worked within the sort of Eastern paradigm? I think there's a lot to say. We can maybe come back to the soft PowerPoint, but I think it's going to be a rocky time ahead, and the buzzword of the day will be geoeconomics. And as my friends say on alliances and partnership, the Chinese can sell you silk, but the Americans will always sell you steel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adel. I think you made everybody hungry between tuna, al dente, and cookies, but and sushi. So we'll probably, the break will be welcome. But thank you. So I just before I move on to the last question for Dr. Naylor, if I can maybe ask the audience to maybe scan the QR code and submit questions. I have a couple, but perhaps if we have a few more, then that could be a way for the panelists to continue sharing their insights. So last but not least, a question to Dr. Naylor. You're heading a diplomatic academy that's based in both Oxford and Cambridge. And so how do you train current and future diplomats on, how they need to understand alliances versus partnerships, and what future trends do you foresee will shape these global partnerships or these regional partnership models, given the increasing number of non-traditional threats, as Dr. Elham was mentioning, as Adel hinted to as well. So how do you sort of explain that to diplomats, and if you are to sort of forecast that into the future, what do you see are some future trends that could affect these?
That is a great question. Two questions, really.
Yeah.
And it goes without saying that we think a lot about this back at the academy. Let me answer in two parts. I'll actually talk about trends first, and then how this translates into training. I think there are two trends that I want to bring to the fore. The first, to build directly on Adel's point, or at least one of them, is that one of the big transformations that we're seeing, and I think we need to see now, is a movement away from sort of the dominant understanding of alliances being rooted in the idea of deterrence, or at least sort of the default idea, towards partnerships rooted in the idea of resilience. And so by that I mean, the deterrent form of alliance was, sort of paradigmatically, say, the NATO alliance, or at least it was. That worked until it didn't for most of the 20th century. But when it comes to the non-traditional threats that will typify where we are heading, not just where we're heading, but where we are now, deterrence won't save us. We cannot deter climate change. We cannot deter the next pandemic. And so that's why I think we really need to move towards thinking about partnerships, security partnerships, in terms of resilience. The brute fact is that bad things are going to happen. We can't avoid that. And so what we need to invest in terms of partnerships, are those that will allow us to bounce back quickly, to be resilient, to mitigate the worst of what could have happened. And I think we've got already a taste of that in the pandemic. So that's sort of broad trend number one that I think I want to bring to the fore. The second, and again, to pick up on something we've already heard this morning and also in the panels earlier, is a shift from global multilateralism, a shift in emphasis, to be clear, not absolute shift, from global multilateralism towards regional minilateralism and more functionally focused coalitions. So I've spent the past 15 years of my life predominantly working in and around the G20. The G20, or I guess one of the conclusions of that work is that this type of global governance organization is decreasingly fit for purpose in today's world. I think the G20 was amazing to rise to the challenge of the global financial crisis in 2008. Things would have been a lot worse without the G20 coming together at the leaders' level. But in the 17, 18 years since, the number of issues that the G20 claims competence over has proliferated. The membership has remained effectively static. And in this era, which again is a dominant theme, not just of today and of this forum, but of our international lives, in an era typified by increasing geopolitical contestation, this is a consensus-based organization, and there's not a lot of consensus to be found on the big things that really matter. And so I really think we need to be thinking about investing increasingly on minilateral, regional organizations, governance groups, informal and formal, and functional coalitions built around single issues. So that's it for trends, at least that I'll table. In terms of training, I think one of perhaps the biggest point that I want to hopefully get across is that while the world, not just that we're heading into, but the world that we find ourselves in now is typified by non-traditional threats that are qualitatively different in nature, more complex, and of greater impact than many traditional security threats. But diplomacy as an institution is one of the levers that we can pull on to rise to those challenges, to address them. Diplomacy, its essence, endures. And we ought not reinvent diplomatic education and training when the essential tasks of negotiation, representation, communication, and the mediation of estrangement remains useful, and if anything, are skills that are increasingly in demand. And so, this is why we continue to do this sort of work. But I do think that there are tweaks to be made, and I'll conclude with just throwing three of them out there. First, I think increasingly we want to engage in training that, again, shifts emphasis more towards sectoral and issue-specific expertise, away from regional and country-specific knowledge. Still useful, but particularly when I think about the activities that we carry out in the academy, we can have a particular added value in doing that. Just to cite one example amongst many, digital and data literacy is supremely, I think quite obviously important. This doesn't mean that we all need to become programmers, we don't all need to learn how to code, but we need to be fluent in the language of data and digital in order to negotiate and this world. A world that is, not just data-driven, but data-saturated. So that's one. The second thing, and this is something that is at the very heart of what we do, is this sort of training ought not just be for state-based diplomats working in foreign ministries, which is why we work with the whole panoply of internationally focused actors. We work with investment organizations, we work with banks, we work with international lawyers, we work with civil society actors and NGO representatives. Again, just thinking about non-traditional security threats, it is in the private and non-governmental sectors that the capacity lies to address these complex challenges. And so these are the actors that we need to ensure are ready to go when we need them. And so we do a lot of work around that. And then finally, to conclude, and again, this is about a shift in emphasis. We've still got to do the more traditional training, lecture-based seminars, discussions, reading books, writing books. But what we've seen is that practical and experiential learning really, really has a huge effect and a rapid effect in accelerating training and ensuring that it is robust. So we do a lot of work with organizations running simulations, particularly, and given the topic, crisis simulations. And we work not just with organizations, but to conclude again, sort of focusing on partnerships, we work with their partners in these simulations, because what we want to test isn't just sort of how does an organization respond to a particular crisis, but how does what is the resilience of their partnerships? We need to stress test our partnerships as well, because they need to remain in place when things go wrong. So I will leave my comments there.
Thank you, Dr. Naylor. So, okay, so maybe we'll have time for 2 or 3 questions. All right. So since Tristen, you talked about moving into more minilateral, and Dr. Mahmoud, you also spoke about focus on regional partnerships. There's a question here on, and I'm not putting you both on the spot. So this question is for the whole panel. But there is a question here about minilateralism, and is the future of partnerships and alliances, these sort of mini or even microlateral partnerships, and do we see them more evolving given the geopolitical headwinds that we are facing today? And perhaps, related to that, there was a second question as well about that. Is it because, multilateralism in general is in crisis that we're sort of moving away from formal alliances to more fluid, or as you say, Adel, promiscuous partnerships? So I'm not sure who would like to. Polygamous, okay. That's a more politically correct word, but yes, please, Doctor.
I mean, if we look at the history of conflicts, most conflicts are with neighbors, within neighbors. So if that's a kind of a benchmark to understand conflicts and conflict resolution, then we need to look at alliances and partnerships in kind of a dyad. Alliances basically mean security arrangements, and partnerships mostly focus on economic cooperation. So the more countries align with their neighbors, they will reduce their security risks. And I think ASEAN is a great example. As their economic cooperation has expanded, their military expenditures have declined because there is no need to worry about your neighbors. So I think that is the trend of the future. That could be an example for Africa, for Central America, for Latin America, and hopefully for the Middle East, that more economic integration will help countries, to have a different attitude and definition of threat perceptions.
Just in the spirit of debate and to disagree, perhaps, I think the I word is a bit strong. So not to get pedantic, but integration is maybe a bit much, and I'd go with probably cooperation. So largest economy in the region, talking G20, Saudi Arabia. So for Vision 2030 to succeed, and for the region to succeed, we need Vision 2030 to succeed. So digitalization, decarbonization, and diversification, right? In a region of devastation, destitution, dehumanization, right? And disaggregation and decoupling and de-risking, right? Difficult. I come from a region, my origins are from Algeria. The least integrated region in the world in terms of trade volume is the Maghreb. You mentioned Algeria, Morocco implicitly in your comments by talking about neighbors. The plurilateral piece, and I think integration is a little bit too much. I think looser cooperation is actually probably the way forward. The point on geography matters, and sometimes between Iraq and a hard place for some of the countries in the region is well taken. And Yemen has played a massive role in the shyness of FDI, another point you mentioned. But I think the integration, I think this looser cooperation is something that we're looking at. We've just reached the 25th year of the Barcelona process, right? Trying to bring the Mediterranean together, shoehorning Israel, even when a lot of countries didn't have relations with said state. And this point around money, markets, and mobility was always really around migration. So this is I think we have to be, I think, a little bit more realistic about what we can do, and then you can design the sort of governance architecture, the incentives, and go more on the sort of economic approach. And I think that's why the Chinese have been so successful with their kind of Premier League, Division 1, Division 2 of their comprehensive strategic partnerships, and their sort of more friendly relations. And I think that's probably what we're going to see more of: plurilateralism within a concentric circle like the way we're sitting now, within the BRICS, etc. And actually on the BRICS, we didn't get to de-dollarization. We didn't get to the largest exporters and importers being in the same room, but happy to discuss that offline with anybody that wants to.
I just wanted to complement what you both were saying, and when it concerns, because my concern, to be honest, is our region. This is like the Middle East, okay. And if I look at the Middle East right now, we also have to distinguish between the types of states that we're talking about. You know, if I put Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, I can put them on one category, but I cannot ignore the fact that countries like Yemen, I come originally from Yemen, Libya, Syria, these are countries that are more or less in a flux right now. It's just like a divided society, weak states, and all of these regional actors that I just mentioned are putting their hands in these countries as well. So cooperation, partnership within this context, integration doesn't work unless they agree. These regional actors, they agree on an approach of how to deal with these conflicts, and ideological dimension are very difficult to deal with. If you start from an ideological position, I find it very difficult to integrate or to cooperate. And I think you all know what I mean with that. Okay.
I think going back to what I said earlier about agility, so having some form of diplomatic agility when it comes to dealing with the strategic stress that we're seeing around the world at the moment as the global disorder becomes the norm. Countries have to be flexible and they have to find ways to build cooperation. I mean, the UAE has done it very well, for example, the way they've knitted together all of their various SEPA arrangements with different countries, the way that they have shown that a pragmatic approach to foreign policy that centers on stability, security, and prosperity of their people is the way to go. And I think Her Excellency Ilana Naseba's speech was excellent today in the way that it outlined how the UAE is coping with this global disorder. So I think countries have to be innovative in facing this uncertainty around the world right now and knitting together different types of arrangements, whether it's alliances, whether it be strategic partnerships, or whether it be something like the Quad, or whether it be something like BRICS. We just have to be flexible and we have to find new ways of doing things, because the old way is certainly not going to find the security and stability for your people that it used to in the past.
I just wanted to build on what you were saying. What really caught my attention was you mentioning ideology, and speaking as a Canadian right now, the Canadian-American relationship was one where it's hard to imagine a cross-border relationship involving more integration, whether that is, trade. 82% of Canadian trade was with the United States. 95% of the Canadian population is within an hour of the border. A security arrangement in place since 1814. And yet, despite all this integration, despite being aligned on just about everything under the sun, we find ourselves in a position that even just a few years ago is unimaginable. And so I do think that we absolutely need to think beyond just geography and seriously think about ideology and the ways in which that is driving this moment of perturbation that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe perhaps for one more question, just looking into the future. So I think that we've emphasized agility, we've emphasized the need for, to be flexible and agile. We've emphasized how both alliances and partnerships are both useful and we need to look at both. We shouldn't look at alliances in the way that we've looked at them in the past, to sort of just as a means of deterrence, but as a means to thrive, regionalism, focusing on geoeconomics, but just maybe looking into the future. And this is a question from the audience, which I think is a good, segue. Will the fundamental source of future alliances, will it be shared values instead of shared interests? So instead of perhaps, seeing eye to eye on an economic agreement or a regional integration or cooperation, will the future of alliances be, and thank you to the audience member who submitted the question, because I think it's great, will the fundamental source of the future alliances be shared values? Can we exactly? Can we imagine that future, or is it still going to be driven by shared interests?
So my Arab friends would say that the values of human rights had a small H on some items in recent times. So that's going to be incredibly difficult to rebuild. At Ministries of Foreign Affairs I visited in the region in recent times, they said they used to give face time to Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and all of the other players, even at Scandinavian ministry level, but that is a thing of the past. On your point on earlier on, which is kind of connected on like the future of corridors, I think one thing to think about, whether we're going to weave this metaphorical Silk Road into vision programs in the region, or the Iraq Development Road, or IMEC, which should have more than one artery, not the one which is the bottleneck at the moment, it's markets that will drive this. State-owned enterprises in China play a role. India doesn't do FDI very well. And doesn't do state-owned very well, but it'll be markets that dictate, and markets need insurance and predictability. So that's, I think, where we're going to see more sort of more interesting developments in the near term, and interest will supplant and succumb to values will succumb to interest, and they'll supplant. So maslaha will dictate, in short.
Okay, so that's a hard no for you on values, but can we perhaps have the not to put you on the spot, but no, you were actually pretty clear. Please, Doctor.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to focus on values, but every single country around the globe, I think, at this time, is under economic distress. So that's the reality of the globe. So I think, look, in about 10 to 15 years from now, 70% of global population is going to be focused in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. And Nigeria will be a country of 500 million people in not too long from now. And look at the future of India, for example. And Mexico, Brazil, all these countries that are developing quickly. So I think countries are going to be pushed into focusing on their economies more than any other variable. And that's going to be the new kind of a value system in the world. If we cooperate economically, then we're not going to be worrying about other issues. I mean, Middle East is the least integrated region of the world. And only less than 10% of trade is between countries. And most of the Middle Eastern countries trade with the outside world. So that tells us about the level of conflict in this region. So I think if we look at this global trend, it's economic emergencies more than any other factor. Yeah.
Just basically, I agree with you. The future seems bleak, specifically if we look at the environmental challenges that the whole region is facing. And yes, economic interests will dictate a lot of partnership or alliances. But I will never try to ignore the importance of dignity and rights for human beings, which include also economic rights. And that's not only between countries. Between countries, you're right, no one seems to be. But inside of each country, if the social contract is not adjusted to respect dignity and rights of human beings inside of these countries, it's never sustainable, regardless.
I would say that there's always going to be a place for shared values. It's very important to have that. I think as we try to maintain a rules-based international order, we have to keep doing whatever we can to preserve that or protect it. But to be realistic, at the same time, it's always going to come down to national interest, and people's national interests are going to vary. The world is changing and values are changing. So I think we're in for a very bumpy ride when it comes to the international order.
I feel that the door's been left open to reach into IR theory here. So I'm going to go full constructivist here and just finish by saying, like, the choice to prioritize economic interests over others is a value choice. There is nothing natural, there's nothing axiomatic about that. And so that is, minimally, values will always drive things. It's just we tend to live in a world where we think about the market and the economy as being outside of values. But as any Marxist will tell you, that's illusion. So I'm on team values.
I heard one of the other rooms clap, which means that they are already done and we're running a little bit behind. But I apologize, there were maybe 8 questions that I didn't get to from the audience. So I apologize that I was only able to choose 2 of them. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their extremely, interesting and enlightening insights. I think that all of them here will be available if you would like to catch them and maybe continue the conversations on the side. Thank you very much.
Thank you.